We're going to begin or continue talking about the British colonies from 1700 to 1763. We spent a lot of time last time kind of leading up to some of the major events that we're going to talk about in this session. We're going to be talking about the Great Awakening and the French and Indian War. And so let's consider these things, or let's remember what we talked about last time as we begin to move into these major events in American social and political history. And these events, kind of like we hinted at last time, are going to form even modern culture and modern society. But they are definitely going to impact things heading into the American Revolution. So let's begin by talking about the Great Awakening. Here you have a picture of a man named George Whitfield who is out preaching to the community. Right? Heretofore, this was pretty much unheard of. You pretty much did your preaching in church buildings, and people would come to the meetings, or maybe a tent or some kind of a structure. But going out and having open air preaching was not really a common thing necessarily. But this was a populist movement. It was getting away from the gentry or the American nobility, for lack of a better term, away from the wealthy and powered individuals, and trying to focus on those who were less fortunate, those who didn't have significant political, social, or financial influence. And we're going to see why that's the case in just a minute. So the Great Awakening, what caused it? Some people doubt whether or not there even really was a Great Awakening. And as we continue to examine events in history, what we're often going to find is that those who come after feel the effects of many different factors. And because we don't like to have things in our lives that are difficult to understand or complicated to explain, we tend to boil things down into the simplest answer possible. And that's probably what has happened with the Great Awakening. Was there an increase in religious interest in the United States? It certainly seems to be the case. But was there this great massive movement where people became alive with religious furor and lives were forever changed, or the course of the nations was forever changed because of a religious movement in the United States? Well, that is more unlikely. That's probably not the case. So what caused this movement, whatever it was, or whatever we want to call it? Well, first of all, like we mentioned a little bit last time, there's financial insecurity. As more and more people are coming over to the New World, these colonies feel like they're getting smaller and smaller. People who had large tracts of land when they originally came over, as they divided those up amongst their children and grandchildren, the tracts that people were getting were smaller and smaller, which meant there's less food for each family, which means there's less money to go around, which kind of also puts the pinch on indentured servants. It wasn't uncommon for an indentured servant to come over to serve their indentured time, and then when they left, they had to pay a fee to get their land and to gain legal status. It wasn't uncommon for these indentured servants to come, work their 7 years, and then not have enough money or the ability to pay to get their land or their social status. And so many of them were selling themselves back into indentured servitude. So there's a huge burden of financial insecurity. And what you're going to find throughout history is that with many problems, you can just follow the money. When people are insecure about their financial circumstances, they're going to do crazy things sometimes. They'll start wars, they'll start political movements, they'll start religious movements, they'll start all kinds of things because they're worried about their financial situation. There are a couple things you can do to make people really angry. The first thing is don't feed them. The second thing is hurt the people they love. And the third thing is make them worry about money. If any of those things happen, political turmoil is usually the result. So the financial insecurity of the colonists at this time, it plays a huge factor in this movement. There's also some political instability. If you remember, these individual colonies have their own colonial governments. Some of them are royal colonies, some are not. By the end of the British colonial period, all the colonies will be royal colonies, or they'll be controlled by the British government. Britain's going to kind of crack down on things towards the end. But at this point, the colonial governments are largely left to themselves. Even the royal colonies have a large say in what happens in their territory. Well, as various groups are coming together, there's internal political struggle as people are fighting for control over these different colonial regions. So that's going to kind of add fuel to the fire. Because of these things, everybody is worried about a return to the old world order. Many people are leaving Europe, called the old world, coming to the new world because they wanted to own their own land. They wanted financial freedom, financial security, and what they're seeing is those things being slowly taken away. And they're worried that a political and economic elite are going to turn the new world into the old world part due. And they do not want that. So these things also are going to contribute to this movement. Another problem is peace with the Indians. Right? In Pennsylvania in particular, the Quakers there didn't like fighting. They were pacifists. It's not that they were weak or insecure, it's that they didn't like taking human lives. And so rather than fighting with the Indians, they would choose to live in peace. They would broker treaties with the native peoples, and they would make sure that they didn't encroach upon Indian territory. They had fair trade agreements, and they actually purchased land from the Indians, which was becoming increasingly rare. But this peace with the Indians, led largely by those Pennsylvania Quakers, is going to cause internal conflict amongst the colonies. People always like to have an enemy. And if the enemy can't be the Indians, then it's either going to be the other colonists or the French, who at this time aren't causing too much trouble. So the problem here is that they don't have an other. They don't have somebody else that they can focus their animus on, and so their animus or their focus gets turned inward, and they begin concentrating on the problems in their own colonies and their own society, and that's going to cause some turmoil. In addition to all these things, there's a population boom. The population in the colonies is going to be approaching 2 million people. That's a lot of folks in a little bit of territory in the 1700s. The 18th century doesn't have means of mass production like we have today. They don't have huge factories churning out shirts and pants and shoes. They don't have big processing centers that turn out food. They don't have canned food yet. The French military will invent that later. And so there's a lot of issues going on that people are having to deal with, and they're going to be looking for answers. Well, if you can't find the answers with your own money, with your own strength, your own land, your own governments, people tend to look for answers in different places, maybe in the spiritual realm. So this movement is going to begin fracturing and dividing people up into even more groups, right? We tend to think of the Great Awakening as this unifying experience. Actually, it was the opposite. It divided and fragmented people even more because we don't have, again, an external enemy to bring everybody together. So what are the results of the Great Awakening? Let's take a look. It increased tensions. People maybe turned to the spiritual leaders for answers, to hopefully unify, to bring their dreams that are unrealized into fruition. And rather than that happening, it just causes more division. It causes more problems. And so they're not finding answers anywhere, which is going to boil over into what we're talking about in the next topic. It increased rather than decreased the number of denominations. There have been several distinct American movements in religion, and all of them kind of had the idea of unifying people and bringing everybody together. At least that's what they say. Typically what that means is I want to bring everybody together to think like I do. I want everybody to come and believe the same things that I believe. And when you do that, when you force unification, it almost never happens, especially in the realm of religion. And so rather than increasing solidarity, rather than uniting the Christians in the colonies, it separated and fragmented them. And when you read through the New Testament, it's very clear that one thing that God does not like is separation. He doesn't like schisms. He doesn't like divisions. The Ephesians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul spends a great deal of time talking about how important it is for Christians to be unified. So rather than furthering the cause of Christ, at least in this regard, we could say that it was working backwards. Another thing that it does is cause the decay of social structures. Right? There's rules, there's ways that society works in the 18th century, and this Great Awakening starts to kind of erode at those structures. One of the structures in place that this in particularly worked against was the foundation of the clergy. You had to go to a school, you had to be ordained, you had to be approved, appointed by a central religious authority. And that central religious authority would decide where you go, where you preached, what your salary was, and all of those sorts of things. There are even some instances where the central religious authority would approve or disapprove of marriages. So these new preachers going around without degrees, without ordination from one of the central religious groups, they're causing people to start to move away from this idea of a centralized control of religion. And that's not a big step when you start moving it over into politics, getting away from the centralized European powers. And that's going to greatly influence the colonists as we move up towards the Revolutionary War. Another thing it's going to do is these new lights, or these new groups in the Great Awakening, are going to start founding schools. Princeton, Brown, Rutgers, Columbia, all those schools that everybody wants to go to, those were founded by these groups during the Great Awakening because they understood, or they felt the criticisms from the ordained ministers, from the schooled ministers, that you people have no degrees. You have no way of determining who knows anything about the Bible. And so they began to found these schools to kind of credential their ministers who didn't really need credentials. Actually, what you're seeing is the same thing that happens throughout human history. When people start a new movement, they start some kind of new group. Pretty soon, the revolutionaries want to maintain control of the revolution, and they start to kind of put the clamps on. And that's what's happening here. It was fine for the original New Lights to go around with no degree, but now that we've got the movement started, we need to control who's allowed to talk. And so these schools will begin ordination processes for these New Lights who don't need to be ordained. And go figure that out. Also, what it does is it increases in the colonists this independent feeling. For the first time, they're beginning to do things, right? Maybe not for the first time, but for a large part, it's involving people who up to this point really didn't have a say of their own. It was decided by those authority figures. Well, here now, they're getting to decide which religious group are you going to be a part of. What exactly are you going to believe regarding various issues? Up until now, if you had a catechism or a book of prayer or some other religious text, it gave you the answers. But now the American colonists are able to think and for themselves determine what they believe. That's going to be a huge push into the American Revolution as the common sense of the common people becomes increasingly important. This, again, we saw earlier George Whitfield. This is another picture of George Whitfield. Not everybody in the colonies was thrilled with this movement, this Great Awakening. You can imagine that if you were an ordained Anglican minister, and now there's somebody down the street preaching and drawing crowds without a degree, without any kind of authority from an ecclesiastical organization, you might not be too happy with that. And as soon as they begin preaching about how it's wicked to be rich, if you were a wealthy landowner, you might not like them too much either. And so here in this picture, you see George Whitfield being fed information by demons, right? And you have a trumpet blower, another demon, hearkening the crowds, calling the crowds together to come and hear the drivel being pushed into Whitfield's ear by the demon on the right. And then you look down in the bottom corner here, you can see a mother and child being pushed over a cart of goods. And you can see next to them men collecting and scavenging goods. And here there's gold around the feet of George Whitfield and a demon under the stool gathering that gold together. They're basically pointing out or trying to show that George Whitfield is teaching a doctrine of demons. Right? He is leading people to destruction and perdition, because he is not teaching what the ecclesiastical authorities want him to say, and they're trying to paint him out as a money grubber. And you can even see a wolf in sheep's clothing, a couple of them if you look very carefully in the picture. Right? They're pulling out all the stops. They're trying to show that George Whitfield is interested in money and in your things. He's teaching the doctrines of demons, and he is stealing from widows and orphans. Right? It doesn't get more serious than that when it comes to church fights. And so you're seeing everybody pulling out the big guns, trying to label and set people aside as false teachers. That's going to be a big deal. It's going to cause a lot of division, and it's going to take some very powerful forces to begin reuniting people. In this Great Awakening, we had some pretty standard or pretty set religious groups. You had the Congregationalists, the Presbyterians, the Anglicans, the Quakers. The Congregationalists were primarily in New England, and the Presbyterians were in the Mid-Atlantic. Your Presbyterians are going to be mostly Scots-Irish, and your Anglicans are going to be people from England. And there will be some Catholics in places like Maryland. But mostly, these are the four big religious groups, or at least the ones that will be fragmented. There won't be fragmentation in the Catholic Church like you're going to see in these groups. And then last you have the Quakers. So what happens is these Congregationalists in New England are going to be split into basically two groups, the Old Lights and the New Lights. It's going to be the New Lights primarily that are going around founding those new schools so that they can kind of get credentials. And this New Light was based on the idea of getting a new feeling, a new understanding, a new person, when you would hear somebody like George Whitfield preach. And these New Lights would go, and they felt like their experience made them ordained. Right? They didn't need to be schooled and taught. It was their experiences, their feelings, their emotions. So emotions and experiences that gave the New Light the credentials they need to preach and teach. The Presbyterians will be divided into the similar ways, the new side and the old side Presbyterians. The Anglicans will be divided into two groups that are still here today, the Methodists and the Episcopals. Many people who are Methodists don't know that they come directly from the Anglican Church, but they do, with some help from people like John Wesley and his brother Charles, and this movement in the United States. It doesn't happen in a day. Right? They don't disagree and all of a sudden, boom, Methodist, Episcopal. It takes some time, but these are eventually the groups that are going to come out of this Great Awakening. The last group, the Quakers, is one of the most interesting. The Quakers tended to be kind of emotional already. They would gather together in meetings and they would sit and wait at their meeting, and nobody would talk until somebody caught the Spirit. Now, they wouldn't say it in those terms, but that's kind of the modern American religious lingo. They would sit around and wait until somebody was moved. That person may fall down on the floor and convulse. That person may stand up and speak in tongues. That person may turn cartwheels. They may tie and untie their shoe repeatedly. Nobody knows what was going to happen. They just knew that something would, and once that person got the Spirit, then they would begin to teach and preach and instruct, and that's kind of how those movements worked. Well, that's very different from the very structured liturgical rites of the Anglicans or the Presbyterians. And so what they felt is that as these new things came along, they fit right in with it. And so many of the Quakers will become Baptists, or they will stay as Quakers, and they will just move over wholesale into this movement. And so many modern American groups are going to be formed or restructured because of the events that happened during the Great Awakening. But as you can see, it wasn't necessarily that many new people were being converted. It's just that there's a lot of new groups now. And so when you go back in history and you look, it may seem like there's this huge surge in religious idealism and people are flocking to the cross of Christ. Well, that's not necessarily the case. It's just that there's more division. And so sometimes we see things in our history and we want to spin it in the most positive way, in particular when it comes to religion. But unfortunately, religious people don't always follow the Christ very well. And in this instance where you have so much division, that seems to be the case. Now, I'm not saying that people who did this were insincere or they weren't genuine in their beliefs. But we have to be very careful that we don't allow our zeal and our emotions to get the better of us, and we actually wind up disobeying God in an attempt to follow Jesus. So that's going to bring us to the next event that we're going to talk about today. And it's, this immigration problem, right? What's leading up to the French and Indian War and what's leading up to the American Revolution is the turmoil in the colonies, internal and external. And today, we still have lots of discussions when it comes to immigration. Politicians today, right? The government recently shut down because the politicians couldn't agree on immigration. And what you're going to find is that throughout U.S. history, immigration has always been an issue. We tend to think of the United States as a melting pot, and well, really that's not so true. It's not true until there's some big conflict that brings people together. And so it's not really a melting pot. It's people living together, well, living in the same place, but not really living together. These early colonists, we tend to view them all as being united together, as being interested in freedom and democracy, and all wanting the same things. That's just not the case. In fact, what you see is that there are many different groups of people coming over. There are Germans coming over. There are a few French people in the American colonies, but not too many. They tend to stay in the French colonies, not the British ones. There are some Spaniards, but again, not many. They tend to stay in the Spanish colonial areas. But there are lots of groups coming over from the Netherlands and other places, and the Scotch, the Scots, the people from Scotland, the Scots-Irish, the English themselves, many people coming over and settling. And what we see when they come over is that not only are there many different groups, but they live in isolated groups from one another. They maintain their distinctiveness. Germans who come over from Germany don't learn to speak English. Right? Germans who come over from Germany keep speaking German. They publish German newspapers, they publish German periodicals, they have German plays, they have worship services in German, and the same will be true for the Dutch that come, for the people from other places that come. They gather together in their communities, they don't disperse, they stay together, they keep their what makes them unique. And so they're going to keep their languages, they're going to keep their traditions, they're going to keep their religions. This is a very different story from what we often hear about America being this great melting pot where people came together and just assimilated right away. What you see is that when immigrants move to a new place, they tend to live with other immigrants from the same place they came. And then they tend to keep their language. They tend to keep their traditions and their religion. And so when somebody moves to the United States today from an Islamic country, should we expect them to stop speaking Arabic? Should we expect them to stop being a Muslim? Should we expect them to live in a community that has no Muslims in it? No. We should expect them to move into a community that's predominantly Muslim. We should expect them to keep their Arabic language, or whatever language they spoke at home. And we should expect them to keep their religion. That's what immigrants have always done. Now, they may learn English. You kind of have to now because the way commerce works has changed so much. But we shouldn't expect them to behave differently. Immigrants coming to the United States today, we shouldn't expect them to behave differently than immigrants coming to the American colonies in the 18th century. Immigrants have always behaved the same way. And so when we begin looking at this, it highlights some repeated problems in our history. One of the first problems is that in order to unite, we need a common enemy. Because we are a nation of immigrants, we don't really have anything necessarily to unite the nation together. We need an external enemy to unite the people in this country or in the colonies together so that they feel more unified. Otherwise, they're happy to be in their separate groups and to not mix. We need, or we have always had, a fear of outsiders. It's interesting to read in the 18th century, people who had themselves just come over 100 years before, now were afraid of these new immigrants. They were afraid they were going to steal all the land, they were going to steal all the jobs, and they were going to take all the money. Sound familiar? Those are the same complaints that people make about immigrants today. They're going to take our jobs, they're going to take our money, they're going to increase crime. That actually was one of the biggest concerns in the 18th century, that these immigrants would come over and that they would murder and pillage and destroy things. And that hasn't changed, has it? It's still the same fears that people have today. We are a nation, because we tend to kind of be in little isolated pockets, we fear the different. Right? We fear outsiders. Now we can argue that that's a natural human condition. People tend to fear things that are different, but that plays a big part in American politics and the history of our nation as a whole. Also, we have a problem with concentrated wealth. Now that doesn't mean that having wealth is bad, but it means that it causes some unpleasant reactions. You may remember from a few years ago, if you are old enough or if you have read about it, that there were big protests in Wall Street because people were upset with concentrated wealth. Well, what tends to happen in every culture over time is that there's a group of people who become wealthy and there's a group of people who become less wealthy. There's a wide variety of reasons why that's the case. But every time wealth becomes concentrated in the United States or in what will become the United States, it causes some big problems. The other issue that we have had, again, is segregation. You can see that with these immigrant groups that segregate themselves. There are also times throughout our history where we force segregation on people. It's never a good thing, and it's something that we have to repeatedly overcome, something that we have to be aware of so that we don't make the same mistakes that people did in the past. Now that's going to bring us to, if you like history and you happen to be a boy, this is probably one of the things that you're going to be most interested in today's discussion. I don't know, maybe everybody. The French and Indian War, officially called the 7 Years' War. Now, what would happen in this time is they would tend to name the war after the monarch in power. So you have King George's War, you have King Anne's War. The problem is when you have 5 Georges in a row, you have to start coming up with different names. And so this gets called by the colonists the French and Indian Wars, and over in the rest of the world, the 7 Years' War. It didn't last 7 years in the colonies, so maybe that's why they give it a different name. But what caused it? Right, we see it begins fighting. The fighting begins in the colonies, at least, in 1750. The fighting doesn't begin over in Europe until 1756. So what causes the French and Indian War? Well, trade disputes. Remember, follow the money, and that's going to take you to a lot of the problem. The Indians were trading solely with the French for quite some time, and now they had begun trading with the British, and the French weren't happy with that, and it just causes a whole bunch of problems. There are also imperial rivalries. Right? We have to remember we're dealing with huge global empires, not just the colonies over in this continent. And the French and the British are fighting in other places too, or they're vying for control of other places, especially over in Asia and in that area, around India. So those rivalries, those problems are going to kind of spill over into the colonies too. There are also disputed land claims. The French and the British claimed a lot of the same land. And back in this time, without GPS or very accurate mapping systems, it would be easy to claim the same land, even if you did it unintentionally. Sometimes, most of the time, it's on purpose. But disputed land claims were a large reason why this fighting is going to break out. And we also maybe have a picture of the Indians that isn't fair, because they wind up being defeated. We tend to think of them as a lesser people in some way. We tend to think of them as lesser in their warrior abilities. We tend to think of them maybe lesser in terms of economic sensibilities or their political wherewithal. But actually, the Indians played this perfect. The Indians knew that the French and the English were upset about the land. They knew they were upset about the trade disputes. And the Indians would like nothing more than for all these colonists to fight each other and leave. Right? And so what they do is they kind of play both sides. They bait them into fighting. It was strategically brilliant by these native peoples. They did a masterful job in working toward their own political ends using this conflict between the French and the British. Also, again, follow the money. Fur and sugar. As soon as the British begin impacting these two major parts of the French economy, the French are going to be upset and they're going to begin to fight back. And so that's pretty much what's going to cause the French and Indian War. The French and the British have been fighting each other for a very long time at this point. It's almost like it's a pastime. Some people play tennis or football. The French and the English, they kill each other. And so that plays into this too. It's just another war. And so choosing to begin it isn't maybe as big of a decision for the political leaders as it would be otherwise. Now, that doesn't mean that the people doing the fighting didn't want it, but what are you going to do? So the results of the French and Indian War: increased taxation. Wars are expensive. And the British felt like if we're sending soldiers over to protect the colonies should bear some of the expense. Remember, England has been fighting for a long time. England has been fighting all over the world, and the people in England are tired of footing the whole bill. And so they feel like, well, maybe the colonists should pay some too. So the colonists are going to get taxed. There's a huge rally cry that's going to be famous during the American Revolution. What is it? No taxation without representation? Right. Follow the money. As soon as you start messing with people's money, bad things are usually the result. So we're also going to see an increased military presence. That's going to lead to rules with the English declaring that the colonists had to give the soldiers quarter. They had to give them a place to stay. It's going to be another big thing with the American Revolution. But you can see the British perspective too. We're sending soldiers over to protect you. You should help feed them and house them. So you can see both sides of the argument. Another problem for England, but good for the colonies, is that they finally have their external enemy. They have the French and the Indians. And so now they can focus on those groups and they can unite together. And what the French and Indian War does, more than anything else in the colonies, is it begins to unite the colonists together, and it's going to give them a sense of a oneness or a unitedness. Sound familiar? Like the United States, right? So before the French and Indian War, there was a meeting. The governor of New York, whose last name was Clinton, called together a meeting on what the colonists should do about the Indians. There were 3 colonies that sent delegates. After the French and Indian War, when they start meeting together, everybody goes, because now there was a feeling of unity amongst the colonists. They felt together because they had external enemies. And when you have external enemies, you tend to unite internally, even if you don't agree about everything. You might remember after 2001, when the World Trade Centers were attacked, it didn't matter if you were a Democrat or Republican, everybody banded together, because now there was an external enemy. It's going to put the French Empire in disarray also. And what this means is it's going to pave the way for this guy that you may have heard of named Napoleon. Right? There's a lot of unrest over in France already, and there's going to be more unrest, there's going to be revolution, there's going to be all kinds of incredible things going on, and it's going to allow a man by the name of Napoleon eventually to come into control. So who would have thought that huge expense and huge loss in the New World will eventually lead to a French empire that will span almost all of Europe? All right, and in both places, France and England, in particular England, the English colonists are beginning to get tired of fighting. They're especially getting tired of fighting away from England. If we have to defend London, we'll be there. But if we have to go die in the woods in Pennsylvania, we're getting tired of that. That is going to play into a huge part of why the colonists will be successful in later wars against England. All right, the last thing, and maybe one of the most important things, besides uniting the colonists together, is you trained them to fight. That was necessary, but it's going to have some unintended consequences. There's a man who is a major in the army when the war breaks out. He'll be a colonel by the end of the army, and he will go on to be the general of the Continental Army, George Washington. You're training the American colonists to fight. You are teaching them tactics. You are giving them weapons and munitions. You're giving them everything they need to begin a rebellion, and eventually they will.